Order. This is the Transport Select Committee's 6-month evidence session on the progress of HS2. And we have two witnesses before us. Can I ask them to introduce themselves for the record? Perhaps we'll start with the Mayor.
Yes, I'm Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands. I'm Mark Thurston, Chief Executive of HS2.
Well, Andy, Mark, thank you very much for being with us. And I should just state, if it's not absolutely obvious, we're not in Parliament, but we are in formal proceedings. We're delighted to be in Birmingham. The Select Committee, when we were formed after the new Parliament in 2019, pledged that we would go out on the road. We'd look at HS2 every 6 months and we'd look on the line of route. We've been unable to do that thus far, but we're now free to do so, and it's been brilliant to be here in Birmingham. We're looking forward to going to see the Curzon Street site this afternoon, and we've met with some of the business leads before you as well in an informal session. I should extend a warm welcome to Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown and Sean Bailey, members of the Public Accounts Committee. The Transport Select Committee and the Public Accounts Committee work very closely on the scrutiny of HS2. So, without further ado, perhaps I can ask the first question. We're going to look at, first of all, the construction of HS2 and the progress before we then move on to the potential economic effects, which will perhaps more be for the Mayor. Mark Thurston, if I can start with you as an opener, if we could get our sort of 6-month progress report on the construction of HS2 and where we are, and are we on track?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'll really use for reference the Minister's report to Parliament, because that gives us a sort of good drumbeat. We're getting into now drumbeat with the Minister of his 6-month reports, but I'll try and give a bit more colour of where we got to. But in sort of summary terms, where are we on phase 1? About a year to go on enabling works. So we've been doing enabling works now, sort of just pre and then mostly since Royal Assent in 2017. Demolitions, utility diversions, archaeology work, some of which you'll see today. Obviously, well advanced now with land acquisition. We're inside the last year of powers, so a focus for us is making sure we acquire all the outstanding land with the powers expiring in February of next year. Of course, we let the civils contracts back in 2017, and they notice to proceed just over a year ago was very much a milestone in moving to the second phase for the civils. So what the civils contractors have been doing over the last 12-15 months is completing their mobilisations, standing up their resources, getting really much into sort of completing scheme design and into detailed design. And again, if you were to sort of do a fly-through of the route, you'd see, and as the PAC did only a few weeks back, saw the sort of benefit of the work with the South Portal there, where we've now literally got tunnelling machines in the ground. 4 stations on phase 1. We've appointed contractors for 3 of the 4. So today you'll see Curzon Street. We've appointed Maestro Gardos. Maestro Gardos are doing Euston for us, and BBVS are Old Oak Common, where we had the Secretary of State the other week. We're now out to the market on Interchange Station, just not far from here, down towards Solihull. And then the sort of next phase of us for sort of procurement is all the railway systems, so track, electrification, telecom, signalling. So we've got about 18-24 months of sort of fairly intense procurement activity on the railway systems, having got very much now into delivery on the civils construction. Final piece on phase 1 is to say that sometime later this year, we would hope to award the contract for the rolling stock, which will be, we're in the sort of final phase of that. There's a 5-staged process for rolling stock procurement. We're in the final stage there. We would hope to be in a position to award that, or certainly recommend an award to ministers in the autumn. So that, I guess, perhaps is a summary on phase 1. Phase 2A, obviously Royal Assent early this year, later than we would have thought for a range of reasons, but nevertheless we are now mobilising our capability and the supply chain for phase 2A between Birmingham and Crewe, and you'll see that's following a similar pattern to phase 1, but of course there's a lot of lessons going into our thinking around contract packaging, organisation, how we deal with land acquisition and the like. And then the final sort of piece of the jigsaw that the company's responsible for is phase 2B, so Crewe to Manchester, and we've got the hybrid build team now sort of on their 3rd episode of hybrid builds, and we are targeting having the bill deposited no later than the early part of next year. And we're well on our way there to get that deposited for the route into Piccadilly. So I think that's, if you take 1, 2A and 2B in turn, probably as much of a summary, and perhaps you might want to sort of push me on some of the specifics around that.
Thank you. And I was going to ask you what impact the pandemic has had on your progress, and whether you've fallen behind or indeed the costs have looking like they'll overrun?
Well, there have been some costs associated with COVID, and we put a range of those costs. I think it's going to take realities until we fully understand the sort of washout of COVID and the full extent of the pandemic. It's going to take us, I think, some months yet before we fully understand, but we did declare through the Minister's report to Parliament a range of COVID costs early this year. In terms of timing, I mean, credit to the supply chain, they adapted pretty quickly to the new standing operator procedures that were agreed with the Health and Safety Executive back in the spring of last year. And inevitably, again, it's quite hard to sort of put your finger on it, but there would have been some impacts on productivity and production. But in the round, we're broadly where we want to be. There have been, the impacts of COVID have manifested themselves in multiple ways around staff absences. We had a lot of offshore design in India that was impacted, for example. But in the round, we've tried to absorb the schedule implications, but there clearly has been some cost associated with it, which we, as I say, we're working through. I have every expectation that we'll sort of land on something that we'll agree with the department sometime later this year.
And so have you not yet put a figure on what that may be in terms of the cost? So
in the parliamentary report, bear with me, I'll just check exactly the numbers that we said. I don't want to misquote what the Minister said last time, but we put a range of, I think it was 300 to 500 million. So we've got a range on the impact of COVID as of, we said an estimate of 400 million as a sort of estimate back in the spring. That continues to be a piece of work we're working with the suppliers on to really understand what's the basis of that. Of course, we've had lots of impacts on the civils programme in particular, some delays to land access. We've had protester action, which I think has been somewhat sort of is overlapping with the impacts of COVID. So sort of trying to sort of unstitch the very specific COVID cost, but by its nature, we'll have to come up with a sensible formula for that. But it's an increasingly sort of discrete cost line in all of our contracts. So we're working with the contractors to make sure they help us understand what the impact has been to them. Yeah.
And TfL furloughed some of their staff. Did you end up furloughing any of your staff?
No, not at all. The one area where we had, I think, a genuine problem was in London. So our enabling works contractor generally did stand down. We were looking to do a lot of work around Camden, where local residents weren't very happy with having people close by. As you recall, in the early days, getting into London was quite challenging. So actually, the London end of the project probably suffered more in the first 2 to 3 months. Certainly as we got further north, and certainly to the credit to the teams up here in Birmingham, we were sort of able to navigate some of the constraints of COVID from the outset.
Okay, thank you. Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
May I start, Chair, with thanking you for allowing me to guest on this committee, and thank Mark Thurston for organising the PAC visit to Rickmansworth. That was really very helpful. So, are we on time and on budget on Phase 1? 35 billion cost of Phase 1 plus 10 billion contingency. Is that still viable number?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the start date of, without Euston, of 2029 to 2033, is that still a realistic timetable?
Yeah, very much so. We're still within the ranges that we published back at sort of notice to proceed last year.
So you've spent 11 billion already. Mm-hmm. You've contracted 12.5 billion, and you've got 11.5 billion still to go. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. You told us in the Public Accounts Committee the other day that you expected to complete civils by 2027, and thereafter would go into systems. Having just had last week a visit to Crossrail and seen the scars of the difficulties of integration of systems, the delays and cost overrun, could I ask you again, I know I asked you in the PAC, but just for the record here, what exactly you are doing to learn lessons from Crossrail to make sure that doesn't happen on HS2?
Yeah. Good question, and I'll try and do that justice as I did in PAC. So thanks, Geoffrey. I mean, a couple of things. One is there's a lot of very sort of formal learning coming out of Crossrail. So we've had a lot of interaction with the team at Crossrail themselves, Mark Wild and his team. So as well as building on the work that the department has done, as well as you know in this space. In terms of sort of some of the practical things we're doing, we're looking at how we manage the interface between contracts. We're looking at how we manage the handover between civils into systems. We're looking at our arrangements now for systems integration, sort of 10 years out before the railway is due to be complete. So this is sort of enshrined in much of the management arrangements in the company today. We've brought an systems expert panel in to sort of really hold a mirror up to our arrangements. It's an international panel chaired by a sort of renowned expert in this field from from Arup, and he's pulled together a panel there. We're doing a lot of planning right to left, so we're very much working. If you think in sort of the project world that I come from, you tend to plan left to right, but we do a lot of work planning right to left. So actually, what does day one of rail opening look like, and working back, because it's quite a complex process to bring a new railway into operations. We've enshrined much of the sort of learning, and there's a whole series of, there's a sort of tracker of all very specific things that our board are holding us to account to through our audit committee. So there's a level of visibility at the board level on the things that the company's needing to do to demonstrate that we're staying true to those lessons from Crossrail. And I think the reality is these things will be with us now for some time, and certainly already, we're having, I think another thing we've done which is quite important is HS2 as the ultimate program integrator and the system integrator. We recognise that we need to set out what we call the reference design. So we need to own the design to a certain level of definition and make sure that all the sum of the parts create the whole railway system. And that reference design will be put into all the major contracts, and that will create some boundaries from which the supply chain will need to respond for these systems contracts that I said a moment ago we're going to start procuring now. So, ultimately, the test of all those arrangements in reality will play out in the fullness of time, but we're confident we're putting all the right arrangements in place. There are some specialist skills we're going to need to bring into the organisation in the fullness of time, but again, we've had an open conversation with Mark and his team at Crossrail about how we might want to migrate some of that capability across, because the reality is in this sort of world, it's a bit of a black art. There's only a handful of people around the globe who really get to do this stuff, and it will be in our interest to make sure we see some of those folks come to HS2 in the fullness of time, but not before they finish Crossrail, clearly. So it's a combination of management arrangements, contract arrangements, capability and people in the organisation, the way we're going to govern the organisation. I think one of the sort of key reflections, I think, from the Crossrail experience is the organisation didn't transition itself in terms of its sort of DNA and capability at the appropriate times. And certainly we're very clear that having gone through an organisation change sort of 2 years ago, I'm making some changes to my leadership team this summer. We've got another sort of inflection point in about 3 years from now as we really get into stations. So again, the organisation will need to stay agile and sort of nimble, and the sort of demographics of the organisation will need to reflect the fact that we're doing different types of work over the next 8 to 10 years.
Well, thanks for that full answer, but it is a really important subject. Now, you've now got Rail sent for Phase 2A, which, according to the Accounting Officer's assessment of the 16th of June, has an opening date of 2030 to 2034. Is that still realistic?
Yeah. We reset the
And a cost range of 5.2 to 7.2 billion. So that opening range coincides, at least on the earlier dates, with the opening range of Phase 1. How do you intend to integrate the two phases so that they do more or less open at the same time?
Well, and that's work in progress, and will be such for for a little while yet. So the intent is to open what we call a captive service. So effectively proving the high-speed system works between actually Curzon Street here and Old Oak Common. So we will open the railway, and people will terminate on the railway when it first opens, Old Oak Common in London, as you say, not into Euston. Of course, when you open Phase 2A, you connect the new high-speed system onto the existing railway just near Crewe, and because it connects on the West Coast Main Line, that's quite a profound change to the way the railway will work, and will obviously then flight effectively. You could fly, if it was timetabled, and this will be something we need to work out with the West Coast operator, how we would then flight high-speed trains off of the high-speed system onto the conventional network and run trains potentially into Manchester on the existing network. That's quite a profound change the way the timetable works in this country, and I think, frankly, we, with us and what will become GB Railways, we will need to work that out with the operators in the fullness of time. And what's the right sequence of events to make sure that we future-proof both the high-speed system and the interface between the high-speed system and the conventional railway? But it's in our thinking, is the point.
Okay, and Phase 1, when you do open. That's how are you going to actually open? What's the sequencing when you're going to actually open?
Well, the expectation is that the railway will open for passenger service in that window that we've committed to between Old Oak Common and Curzon Street
Yes. Yeah.
as,
Okay.
as a sort of standalone captive high-speed service.
But then hopefully going the other way as well, pretty quickly after you've opened phase 2A.
Yes, yes. I think it would be premature, but I would not envisage trying to open those two things at the same time, because I think you're creating too much technical complexity, railway complexity. So I think incrementally, taking a staged approach, opening the captive system between Curzon Street and Old Oak Common, and then ultimately go south into Euston as Euston becomes available, and then north, as you say, onto 2A up to Crewe.
So 2B has a cost, this is looking further out, of course, has a cost range of 32 to 46 billion. That's still, given the NAO's comments about going through two city centres, Manchester and Leeds, and the difficulties of ground in 2B, I mean, the 46 billion compared to phase 1 at 45 billion still looks quite an optimistic figure, isn't it? For
Well, at the moment,
2B?
we're only working on phase 2B West, so we're only focused on, and the company's only been asked by the department to focus on the route into Manchester, and the eastern leg will play out in the fullness of time, and we expect it to be in some fashion as part of the integrated rail plan. So what we're focused on is producing a budget and a plan with the, as I say, we're working on the hybrid bill to get royal assent somewhere around 24-25, subject to parliamentary timetables, for the section into Manchester. And that's where our focus is at the moment. The company's not doing any work on anything else at the moment.
So those three figures, 45 for phase 1, 46 for phase 2B, and 7.2 for phase 2A, come to 98.2 billion plus 5 billion for the stations. That takes us to about 103 billion. Is that where we are with the entire cost of high speed at the moment?
Well, again, off the top of my head, I can't recall. The 2B you referred to there is both the eastern and western legs combined.
Yes.
And that was, I think, the assumption at the point when those numbers were published was the assumption phase 2B was going to be done as one integrated project. So the whole railway north of Crewe into Manchester, and from here in the West Midlands all the way in through the East Midlands to Leeds. That's not now playing out that way. We're taking the western leg now as a very discrete project, and we wait to be guided by the department on what we do with the eastern leg.
So can I perhaps just finally bring in the Mayor here? Good morning, Mr. Street. We, as the Chair has already alluded to, we had a panel of business people representing LEPs, local authorities and rail and so on, and they made the point quite strongly that actually if we did the western section of the Y but not the eastern section of the Y, we would be in grave danger of leaving the East Midlands seriously behind. Places like Leeds, Leicester, York and so on would become sort of second-class cities compared to the western section. Is this something you're concerned about, and if so, what representations are you making to government?
So there's a number of points here. First of all, it's essential that the railway is built north of Birmingham rather than just south. I know that's not specifically the point you're asking, but let's be really clear about that for two reasons. If you look at the connectivity that we need to the northern markets is arguably more important than an improvement to the southern markets. And perhaps the clinching point, though, is if you look at the business case, you only get the repayment on the southern leg if you complete all of the Y. So there's a very hard point there. And to your numbers, that 45 million or 46 million for 2B, that does assume, as Mark said, both are built to get the repayment, frankly, on the investment that we've made in the core in the southern legs. So purely from a business point of view, there's that need to build the whole lot to get the return. Now, in terms of what businesses are saying here, we want all of it, of course, inevitably. The critical thing for us is connectivity within the different parts of the Midlands. The weakest elements of connectivity from Birmingham at the moment are to Manchester. That's taken care of. And of course across the west and across from the West Midlands to the East Midlands. So the Birmingham-Nottingham link, and of course the Birmingham-Derby link, and the Birmingham-Leicester link are all essential ingredients for us. Now, the honest truth is there are different ways that those can be achieved. You do not need to build the whole of 2B Eastern Leg high speed for West Midlands business to get what it needs for connectivity across the Midlands. And so, although I have always been a huge believer in the full network of HS2, and as I've said, the business case actually explains why you need to do the whole lot, actually the pressing issue for us from an operational point of view is connectivity within the Midlands.
Thank you very much. Quick question, last question to you, Mr. Thurston. When do you expect to let Interchange?
I think the middle of next year, I think, Sir Geoffrey. Let me just check my date. We're out to market.
Because we were hearing this morning how critical it is to this.
Yeah,
system.
yeah. The contract wall for Interchange, I thought it was June 22 is the current target date. So by this time next year, we should have let that contract.
And you have just let Curzon Street, so we'll see that.
Curzon Street's away, you'll see that later.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Carl, you wanted to come in.
Just a very quick question to Mr. Streets. You just mentioned there that your priority is obviously for the area that you cover your way with the DPI. Do you think that people will be
Sorry, Carl, can you put your mic on? You're not being picked up.
Did you pick any of that up or not? Do I have to start again?
Yeah, we picked it up.
Right. Do you think the local government players in those cities that were just mentioned by my colleague from PAC might be a little bit disgruntled at what you've just said? Because it might be that you're happy for other ways for that connectivity to be put in place for the eastern leg. They'd like to see, I'm sure, in Sheffield and York, Leicester, Nottingham, and even Lincoln maybe, those proper links put in, shall we say?
I'm sure they would, but I was asked the question as to what the priority was for West Midlands business, and that's why I answered in that way. And also, let's be honest, we all know that there is an incredibly difficult decision that the government has got to make about priorities. And I mean, I think I have been as vociferous as anybody in this kingdom in arguing for the full of HS2. People have accused me of all sorts of things, but we have to face the reality that we now have, and that's that difficult decisions have got to be made. And that's why I gave my honest answer.
No, that's fine. I realise those people in those cities don't vote for you, but I just wanted to make sure that we had that on record. Thank you.
We always welcome straight answers to straight questions. And actually, Mr. Straight, I should also say congratulations on your re-election as well. That was discourteous of me. Right, let's move on to the potential economic effects of HS2, and particularly as to where we are right here in Birmingham and the wider West Midlands. You've touched on it already, but we've got a few colleagues that want to drill in further. Robert Largan, first of all.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, Mr. Street, Mr. Thurston. Mr. Street, what, on the broader point, what economic opportunities do you think HS2 is going to bring to the West Midlands, and what are you doing to capitalise on it?
So when we actively supported HS2 in full, Mr. McCartney, when we actively supported it, it was based on a hard-nosed economic decision that would be a considerable uplift in economic activity here. To refer you to a piece of evidence you might want to take away, rather than me just read out all the data, we did in 2015 what we called our Hs2 Growth Strategy, which identified the uplift that there would be, and that actually was then input into the Oakervie review, which then became the basis of the government's decision. So those hard numbers were taken. We updated that again at the end of last year, and we call this is our sort of latest growth strategy. And if you want to take it as a piece of evidence, all of the assumptions about the increase in employment, the increase in GVA are all in there. So perhaps though you would like to you'd like evidence that it's already happening is perhaps the key thing. We know that already 12,000 jobs have been created across the West Midlands by the promise of HS2, and those of course are those that are directly attributed to HS2's employment, those in their subcontractors, and of course those in businesses that have chosen to invest here on the basis of the HS2 promise. And this is the bit that's the most lucrative but also the most difficult to really understand. But I would just point to one clear piece of evidence. We've just had the inward investment figures by region, and we were once again top region outside London, and in lots of the citations from companies as to why they choose to locate here, HS2 is one of the factors that is called out. So it is very clear that that is already happening. And I think perhaps there's one other piece of evidence I would put to you that says this is already making a difference rather than just being theory. If you look at the slightly longer run of West Midlands economic performance, it was beginning of 2015 that there was absolute confirmation that this was going ahead, and that very much coincided with an uptick in our economic performance. Now, so there's almost like an inflection point on the graph. What is also true, though, is that we've taken a disproportionate pushback through COVID because of a mix of our economy, and we've actually now emerged as the worst affected region of anywhere. So that trend has been broken, but I'm very confident that we can see a correlation between the confidence given to the market before and the outcomes that we saw in terms of inward investment.
Thank you. Staying on that sort of theme of economic benefit and picking up from what my colleague Sir Geoffrey asked about, when it comes to the northern extension of HS2, and speaking very selfishly as someone who represents a seat just on the outskirts of Greater Manchester, what would be the impact if the government was tomorrow to say we're going to cancel phase 2B? What would be the impact on the West Midlands?
Well, I don't think that's going to happen for the Manchester side of it. I think that's utterly secure, as we've heard from Mr. Thurston earlier on. But very simply, we have positioned ourselves as the greatest beneficiary of HS2 on the basis that we will be at the centre, is why you're here today, of the new transport network that will probably provide the spine of the network for the next 100 years. It's a real foundation stone of everything that we're arguing about why to invest in this region in the future. So it would be it's difficult to put a number on it, but it would be a pretty cataclysmic decision for us.
Thank you. And keeping this still in mind, so what are you hoping to see in the forthcoming integrated rail plan?
Absolute commitment to the western leg of phase 2B. I am realistic that there will probably be a serious delay in the eastern leg of 2B. I believe the government will still commit to doing it, but will not be specific about the timing of when. And therefore, the most important thing for us, and Mr. McCartney may accuse me of wearing my West Midlands hat too proudly here, but I think that's why you've asked me to come. The most important thing for us to see in it is a commitment to a project that we call the Midlands Rail Hub, because that provides connectivity into the centre of Birmingham, much greater capacity, and also the rapid links between Birmingham, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester, and Coventry, Leicester, re-establishing that broken link. It's only £2 billion, so it's extremely good value for money, has a very positive BCR. It was in the Conservative manifesto, and putting it extremely bluntly, that's what I want to see action on.
You've already just answered what was going to be my next question. So thank you very much, Mr. Street. I'll hand back to the chair.
Great, thank you, Robert. We'll carry on the same theme with Simon Jupp.
Good morning to the panel. Thank you very much for coming along and allowing us into your region. Mr. Thurston, starting with you, it was touched on in the chair's opening question, but I wanted to just drill into something a bit deeper briefly. We know that COVID-19 cases are rising across the country and across this region with staff using the Test and Trace app and things like that. Are you experiencing a big uptake recently in the amount of staff off sick or self-isolating as a result?
No, I haven't picked up any intelligence to suggest it's got any worse recently. We've had a number of cases right across the supply chain. We've been pretty lucky inside the company itself, recognising a big chunk of our staff are based here in the Midlands. But we've not seen a sort of shift, to your point, in sort of more recent times. We certainly saw something in the early days. I think, again, come back to the contractors and the supply chain, which is where the lion's share of the resources on HS2 are. The contractors have all got arrangements in place, so sensors on arrival, distancing measures and the like on their site compounds. Many of our consultants are still working remotely, but again, I guess they'll start thinking about how they sort of get back to work into some form of hybrid working from next week. And again, as an organisation, HS2, the lion's share of staff continue to work at home, so they're looking after themselves. But again, we are sort of engaging with our employees around what the future of work looks like and how we use our offices to best affect sort of from, in the second half of the year. But I can go and get some data if it's important, but I'm not seeing any sort of trend, I guess, to your question that would concern me.
It's always a concern, isn't it, when you have when you see that other industries being heavily affected by being pinged, and obviously we've seen delays to this project previously. But on a more positive note, obviously the construction of HS2 will bring new skills to this region. It will increase employment. The mayor rightly said 12,000 jobs, I think, was the number he put. What do you think the effect will be on the region for the amount of construction skills that are created as a result of the project you're leading?
Yeah, I think it'll be profound. It's hard to judge because we're talking about something in the future, but having been lucky enough to work around, in my own sort of career around the Crossrail and the Olympics, and London and the South East has been spoilt for sort of big infrastructure projects for some years, and to the Mayor's point, the Midlands of the North have not had that investment, and I think what we'll leave behind, and actually we're seeing it already with our 650 apprentices, with the thousands of people already working here in the Midlands, the suppliers are now creating offices for themselves. They're bringing new people in. So my expectation is that we're creating a workforce for this part of the country, which inevitably will go further north from here as well, of course, with the future phases, and will create capability for the country which isn't there today. And there are lots of green shoots and good examples, and many companies I visited talk about expanding their offices, hiring new people, bringing extra graduates on apprentices in, and they're doing that because to serve this project. They want to be close to their client. In us, we've got a big office around the corner at Snow Hill. We have a small office in Manchester, but I expect that over in time, as once we get the other side of Royal Ascent, we'll need to think about our footprint, probably in Manchester, maybe someone like Crewe. So we are already thinking about how do we sort of take this sort of caravan of capability and take it further north, and as it grows, it will just inevitably attract talent, and so I think it's a positive message, and I think the other thing that is sort of becoming clearer to us as an employer, both directly and through the supply chain, is in the year or so prior to notice to proceed, of course, with the Ochre review, there was a fair degree of uncertainty around HS2. So we were struggling to retain staff, we were struggling to attract staff, and some contractors were even deciding whether to bid for work on HS2. Because to fairness to the government, they continued to fund the essential work through the Ochre review period, recognising the sort of overall schedule impact. As we've got the other side of notice to proceed, and notwithstanding COVID, there's a sort of there's a genuine kudos around the sector now, around working on a project of the scale of an ambition of HS2, and a lot of new staff. One of the things I often say is, "Why join?" They said, this is sort of a once in a career opportunity to be involved in something on this scale. So, I think that's great for us in terms of retaining and attracting talent. We need to be careful we don't hoover up too much talent for the sector because there's only so much resource around. But we've put the college onto a new footing in the last few months with University of Birmingham, which I think is which is great, and and I think the future looks bright in that regard.
I'm pleased to hear progress, especially with the idea of apprenticeships, and you mentioned a couple of numbers there, which are really nice to hear. But we do have a potential issue in the transport sector, and I think you mentioned earlier on about architects or archaeologists, one of the two. Archaeologists, being a shortage of those being available to you. Are you concerned that you might experience in the lifetime of this project a skills shortage? We've heard previously in separate sessions on different subjects about the shortage, for example, of transport planners in the country. There are only so many of these people, and these jobs take a long time to train.
Yeah, I think it's an issue for the sector, and of course we're a big hire of people and user of sort of capability. So of course we have our own skills and employment strategy. We just refreshed that actually to understand what the demand is and what the supply is in the market, which is why we and many of the suppliers are doing so much work. We do a lot of work with the Construction Leadership Council because of course there's a much broader. I think in the paper yesterday, construction's seen its 24-year sort of high of activity, and you're seeing shortages there around HGV drivers, for example. There are without doubt some impacts of Brexit around capability in the country that would have otherwise come from other parts of Europe. So I think it's something we will need to continue to be vigilant on, but we shouldn't underestimate the sort of power of momentum. And there's a momentum around the project now, and I think that people want to invest in projects and in companies where they can invest in their careers with a level of certainty, and I think the organisations, ours and the ones that work for us at HS2 now, are able to give those potential employees certainty for some time, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And the sort of feast and famine of investment in infrastructure that's often talked about in the sort of political sphere, inevitably undermines that ability for companies to invest in skills, in technology, in capability, and HS2 hopefully will be a way of bringing much more certainty to the wider pipeline.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, how much of a concern is a potential or existing skills shortage to you in the delivery of this project? Obviously, you want to see as many local people trained up in jobs, in work, and benefiting from this, not just from transport connectivity, but also basic employment. But are you concerned about a skills shortage?
I'm both happy to answer your question and embarrassed to say the problem is the opposite. So HS2 is essential to provide jobs for people in this region after the pandemic. So if only we were worrying about a skill shortage. We were worrying about chronic unemployment, and this is one of the single biggest ways of addressing it. So we are actively working with HS2 Limited to provide opportunities for young people here. Our target for jobs created by HS2 in the local region over the next 2 years alone is 5,000 jobs. So it's a very fair question, but we see it completely from the other end of the problem at the moment, sadly.
Are you confident then that the mechanisms are in place to create these jobs, but also the training opportunities for these specialist roles?
Yeah, so we are putting them in place. So I can't sit here and say everything. And of course, the jobs that they will have will change over the profile of the programme hugely. So yeah, I'm confident. Perhaps it's an important point I want to make, and I'm glad the questions come out. I'm confident that the relationship is there, that we can work in a planful way towards that. So the regional team, because obviously HS2 Limited is structured on a regional basis, are working actively with us at identifying what is required, and then we work together to make sure those needs are met, and it's hugely welcome.
Clearly, you're attempting to plug the unemployment gap that you previously spoke about with jobs that, because of the actual life cycle of this project, could be themselves temporary.
But this is the whole point, isn't it? So HS2 is the stimulus for other activity in the construction sector. It's the great sign of confidence. So let's just talk again about evidence that occurs. So you're going down to Curzon Street later this afternoon. Fantastic. Some of you probably came in on the existing Avanti train and will have looked out the window on the right-hand side as you approach New Street and will have seen just a wonderful building site. And but what you won't necessarily have seen yet is that in the areas adjacent to that building site, in the quarter of the city that we call Digbeth, we are, if you take a walk through that, you'll see lots of the first signs of construction, the barriers, the early diggers, the enabling works, and just literally in the last few months, planning permission has been granted for huge schemes. One run by Oval Estates, which adjoins the existing West Coast Main Line track, another for the Upper Trinity Street development, and those are things that we've been waiting for probably 20, 30 years, if I'm honest, and the project has given the certainty for those to go ahead, and they will also create a huge number of jobs in the construction sector. Probably worth reflecting on the fact as well that pre-pandemic, the construction sector was the fastest growing part of our economy. They have been the second biggest, that sector's now seen the second biggest reduction in jobs through the pandemic. So what is now happening, catalysed by this, is critical to our recovery if it brings these other investments in.
And obviously, as the mayor, you have to sell that vision, that concept to local leaders within councils, the LEP and the subnational transport body, every single layer of local governance. Is that view that you've got, a very positive view, and nice to hear actually, shared across your region?
I can give you a one-word answer to that: yes.
I'm delighted. And on that point, I'll hand back to the chair.
So thank you, Simon. Carl, I think you wanted another nibble, and then I'm going to go over to Sean Bailey.
Thank you for that, Chairman. Mr. Thurston, you have a plethora of stakeholders, and I hate the word, but I'm going to use it because we all know what it means. And I'm sure if the mayor wants to engage with you, he gets the opportunity to. But we heard from some of the business representatives earlier that there have been some issues, and you touched on retention of good people, etc. But do you think those issues have been resolved maybe with engagement with your various stakeholders on the route, and that maybe has caused some problems for you in the recent past? I'm taking an example of maybe Roger Maidlin, if you remember him from the CEO of Ardent St George with the King's Cross development, which caused all sorts of hoo-ha, but actually he managed to smooth a lot of that over by doing things himself. I'm not asking if it's you, but have you resolved those issues? And
So,
who at a board level is responsible for that community engagement?
I had just want to sort of question, so clarify. Is your issue around sort of community stakeholders? As you say, it's a complex map for us. This project covers a lot of geography. So is it in the relation to sort of the business community and sort of business getting the opportunity to work with HS2, or is it more on communities where clearly our work is having an impact on local people and local business? Just on
There's two distinct parts, but probably the second one of those
The
two is
latter,
more important
yeah.
for this committee at this
yeah,
point.
so we have, and this was the subject of the committee we had earlier this year. Yeah,
Yes.
time flies, Chairman. Yeah, with Mr. Smith. Yeah, I mean this is a big deal for the company. You know, these people didn't choose to live on this route, and of course, you know, I was only in Aylesbury with the leaders and the officials from Buckinghamshire earlier this week, where we've got some real challenges in reconciling the disruption of the work with the impact on local people. And this is going to continue to manifest itself. We have it around here in the centre of Birmingham. We've done a lot of work, for example, with some of the Mayor's team and the Commonwealth Games team to make sure the local transport system is sufficiently resilient over the next 12, 15 months, recognising we've got the Commonwealth Games here in the city. We've got similar issues where we're working very close with Camden around how we sort of keep the area around Euston sort of as a vibrant community while we're being hugely disruptive. And then of course if you get into some of the rural parts you've got different challenges, but for those local people it still manifests itself. So this will is and will continue to be a challenge for us and our supply chain. We've made it very clear to our suppliers that they are going to seriously dial up their sort of credentials in this area of being considerate contractors, and they get that. We won't get it right every day. I mean, we've got a full-time 24/7 help desk. We've got community engagement people in every constituency along the ground. All our suppliers who are now established, the civils contractors who are very much the visible presence, are standing up their own resources. As Sir Geoffrey saw at the South Portal site, what we're trying to do in many areas is build haul roads and create site compounds that make us more self-contained. So we're not putting trucks and vehicles out onto the public highway, not just because of wear and tear and traffic, because of the disruption, the noise. So this is a constant. We've organised ourselves as well we've split the route into 28 areas, 26 on the main route, if you exclude Euston. So for each geographic area, we've got a sort of an assigned delivery manager, so a senior person who's works effectively for me at HS2, who's responsible for sort of coordination of the works on the ground, is the sort of senior point of contact for that local community, whether it be the MP's office or the local authority. So there are multiple touch points, and we need to be vigilant on this issue every single day, because the nature of the work is going to be disruptive for a few years yet, and we need to have respect for the impact we're going to have on those folks who are adjacent to our work.
Thank you for that. We did hear that it had got a lot better in the last 3 years, so you'll be pleased to have that feedback, I'm sure. Thank you, Chairman.
Oh, thank you. It's Black Country Day, so happy Black Country Day, and a voice of the Black Country, Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, so if we could just take a bit of a trip up the road, I think it's important to remind ourselves that the West Midlands obviously isn't just Birmingham. Mr. Street, can you tell my constituents in Wednesbury, Albury, Tipton and Tividale what benefit they're actually going to see from HS2? Because certainly the feedback I'm getting at the moment at times is that this seems to be another example of let's invest in Birmingham and the Black Country will follow suit. What would you say to that charge?
I'd say there were three things to say in response to that. First of all, lots of the SMEs that will actually be getting contracts through this are based well outside Birmingham, and some Black Country SMEs are extremely well placed to do this. Indeed, the very place we held the conference for SMEs in pitching was in Bilston. You can't get more centre of the Black Country than that. The second thing I would talk about is obviously the jobs piece. That I do genuinely believe that applies across the whole of the region, not just to Birmingham. But perhaps the point that your question really usefully draws out is one of the things that is committed in our growth strategy, and this goes right back, to be fair, to the LEP strategy in responding to HS2 before it was even given parliamentary assent, was that every area of the West Midlands will be within 45 minutes of one of the two terminal stations. And the area that was the most challenge to us in that respect was, of course, by public transport, I should have added. The area that was the biggest challenge was, of course, the Black Country. And that is what led to the proposal for the extension of the metro, which, as I know Mr. Bailey knows extremely well, starts if not finishes, in his constituency. So that commitment to the local transport network on the back of HS2 is actually doing my job, probably even more important than actually the delivery of the HS2 line itself.
That's really helpful, actually, Mr. Street. So just turning to obviously to your 2040 vision
Yes.
for transport, how contingent is that, particularly on phase 2? I mean, you announced particularly, and we campaigned together on a very ambitious plan for an integrated transport network that involved metro, light rail.
Yeah.
How contingent would you say that is that on the completion of phase 2, you know, towards the north? I mean, I know you've put a lot of emphasis on not just having that southern link. I'd just be interested to.
Okay, good question. It isn't particularly contingent on the completion of phase 2, because now we will have the 2 terminal stations in the West Midlands, and we will build our local network from that. It is actually, and I will be very straightforward about this, it is completely contingent on the funding for Midlands Rail Hub.
Okay. If I could just then turn to the point you were raising about, that's obviously the Black Country businesses that will benefit. I know, obviously, notwithstanding the supply chain, which I'm sure we can all agree, I've seen those benefits in my constituency with businesses that have been successful within that. But we often hear, when we talk about the business case here, you know, we hear the likes of Goldman Sachs, HSBC, you know, the new Barclays offices that open. What about businesses like Quantum Print and Packaging in Wednesbury, Formbend Steel in Tipton? I mean, what's the benefit? Are they, you know, these are businesses that export, and I think the Black Country's exports last year was something like 3 billion. You know, we still make things. We're still very much a manufacturing area. I'm just curious to understand what their benefit would be from your perception as the combined authority.
The benefit is, of course, those in the supply chain for HS2. And I mean, the interesting thing here is that we think of the supply chain for HS2 as a very specific piece around steel, so great strength for, obviously, the Black Country employers. But it goes much, much further than that. If you look at all of the categories of tender that he's putting out, it's everything from hotel accommodation to temporary porter cabin operations. It's the whole suite that you need for a project of this scale. And I am utterly convinced, the very purpose of having 800 local SMEs in a sort of pitching encouragement, that some of the more, you might think more obscurely linked directly to HS2 will have an opportunity to pitch for that. And for some, the local base will be important because it'll be important in their cost base advantage.
So I totally agree with you on the supply chain point 100%, but you know, if we think, you know, this isn't just a transport plan, is it? This is about the future of our region for 20, 30 years' time. And, you know, hopefully I might still be here dealing with those issues in 30 years' time. For those businesses in 30 years' time, when the project stops, when the supply chain's over, what are they going to see? How, you know, if I go back there in 30 years' time, are they, whoever is running that business, which, knowing Black Country SMEs, it's probably going to be the same family, what benefit will that business have seen, notwithstanding, obviously, the supply chain point?
Okay, so if the total uplift in the economic activity is of the nature that we've said in this plan, let's take a few examples. If they are a business in the housing sector, there will obviously be a higher number of people looking to live and work here, so there'll be opportunities there. If they're a business in the business support area, which a lot in the Black Country are, then obviously there will be greater opportunities for them there. So it is all determined by, can we use this as the kickstarter to change the trajectory of our total economic activity?
I mean, that leads on to a really good point, actually, Mr. Street, because clearly to do that, that is going to be contingent on government stumping up additional levels of investment into the region, not just transport investment that we've seen, but also to do that we're going to see things such as you've touched on housing, redevelopment. I know obviously your brownfield strategy is a very important one to you there. Is there not a risk, given the price tag attached to this, that, and I know this from experience, particularly my communities have recently been burnt by a few sort of missing out on a few support and investment packages, that communities perhaps are but could miss out because of the price tag of the project combined with the fiscal situation that we now find ourselves in, that if we don't balance this correctly, where we still attract that additional investment outside of the transport infrastructure, that we perhaps won't hit those, you know, those markers, those opportunities that you've just articulated there. And how do we ensure that we don't get burnt like that?
So I think there's two answers to that. The first thing is, and this was a really important point in the Ecology review that some of you will know I sat on, even though the total sum is very, very large, the investment here, no one is questioning that, actually the period over which it's invested is very great. So actually the impact on the cash ability of government in each year is more modest, actually. So the risk of the sort of crowding out that you're talking about is perhaps less than maybe implied. But the second reason is the argument with the government is really very straightforward here. I see this as a foundational investment. And our argument has to be, it doesn't therefore lead to crowding out of other investments. It leads to saying to government, you should be doubling down on this opportunity. You've put this foundational investment in, you put us in a really great place. How are we now going to make the most of it? And actually, the flip answer, of course, the third thing I'd like to say just in answering this is, we've taken this purely from a government investment point of view. The reality is the private sector investment will dwarf that government investment many times over. And again, back to the sort of theme of what we're seeing, we are seeing the private sector, or indeed government or government-based organisations, the BBC would be another brilliant example here, they would not be making the investment here, which again will improve jobs across the whole conurbation, not just in the city, if it wasn't for the advent of HS2. I'm very clear on that.
Okay. Thank you, Charlie, about that.
John, thank you. Mr. Street, you're never knowingly unsold, as
I
we
was.
know. Well, you
I
once
was.
were, but on this one, I think you're still going, because you said at around 2 billion, the Midlands Rail Hub is a genuine bargain.
Yes, I
And
did.
you said the Secretary of State for Transport must persuade the Treasury to support this project to boost the region's connectivity and with it the region's economy. How is Grant Shapps getting on, as far as you're aware, in selling that mission on your behalf?
I don't know the answer to that question. He must answer that. But we're very confident of the case because of ultimately because the business case, the BCI, I'm not being soft about this, it's substantially better than the business case for the total of HS2. And when you just think about the fact it will give this city its third cross-city rail line, it will restore the connectivity between Leicester and Coventry, 25 miles between them, no rail link. And if anyone's tried to take the train between Birmingham and Nottingham, you will see that that is pretty dreadful at the moment. So just on the evidence and the business case, I think it's sound. We believe that we're in a good place with DfT, but like everyone else, we don't know what's coming out of the IRP.
And so to pick up one of the points you responded to, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but is it more important that I think you've got 7 projects totaling 3.7 billion,
Correct,
which
that's
that
right.
is one of them.
That's right.
Is that more important to the region, to you, than, say, Phase 2B?
You need to be specific about 2B. There's 2 halves of 2B.
Yeah, sorry, the eastern part of
the
2B.
east, but yeah,
okay, in that case, now you've tempted me. What about the western part of
For the western part of no, that's very clear. And the reason why I'm absolutely clear on this is it's back to something Mr. Thurston said. It connects to the existing West Coast Main Line. So that's what effectively makes the whole investment in HS2 worthwhile, if you get those reduced journey times and better connectivity through the West Coast Main Line. And that's what the western leg does. So that, to me, is an indisputable piece of the mathematics of it all. But to answer your question that you do want to ask head on, it's not about what's more important, it's about what's more urgent. We can deliver very quickly the repayment on the relatively small sum from Midlands Rail Hub, and that's why the business case is so much stronger.
Okay, thank you very much. I could go on, but I think it would be right to hand over to Ruth Cadbury, because we want to talk about the environmental aspects of HS2.
Yeah, and if I may, Chair, I also want to bring in active travel as well. So, Mayor Street, how, in your view, has the HS2 construction impacted on the environment in the region?
Well, the thing that we were fearing is that it would mean that our existing public transport was somehow compromised, and we would find, therefore, that people were turning to more polluting methods of transport. Thus far, I can say there's been no compromise on any of our existing piece, and actually, pre-pandemic, we were managing to increase the usage of our public transport quite dramatically. So there's been no conflict in that way. The obvious issues, of course, have been around and everyone knew this was going to happen. The most political issue has been around the felling of trees, particularly in the Meriden Gap area around Interchange. So what we've been understanding of that, and what, of course, has been critical is seeking the assurances about how HS2 will leave us rather than what has to be done during.
Thank you. And Mark Thurston said earlier that, and that's also been confirmed by our business stakeholders we met earlier, that HS2 is improving its consultation
Yes.
and communication.
That's fair.
Is it also improving it from your perspective? Is it also improving on delivery of commitments around the environment and also on active travel, how people get around as well as to and from the construction sites?
Yes, I think it is. It's probably early days, if I'm very honest, and I'm sure Mark Thurston would say that a lot of this is later down the delivery, but there is already evidence that the promises of legacy in terms of new woodlands, new environmental habitats have been created. So we've talked about a green corridor, we've talked about new sites, predominantly in Warwickshire, and they have been created. So yes, they've been man to their word. They've done what they said they would.
Thank you. And on the design of the route and the two major stations,
Yes.
do you feel that they've done enough to encourage active travel, walking, cycling, and public transport, obviously, to the stations, but also in terms of along the route as well, crossing the route of the line, but also running along the line?
So I think, to be fair to them, it's more our responsibility than theirs, the link to public transport and active travel from the two terminal stations. But I'm probably the most biased person, and you perhaps the citizens may have a different view, but I genuinely believe, and it's back to what I said earlier on, that we've tried to use these as the two stations as integrated nodes in the public transport system. And the best example of that, of course, is the extension of the metro to go literally right under the station at Curzon Street. There are still plans, but no funding, for the metro to go out to Interchange Station, but as we know, that links perfectly with our existing local rail service already there. So yes, I think all the planning, and it's back to what Mr. Bailey asked me about the 2040 plan, we have tried to make sure our transport vision for the region is based on those two stations.
Thank you very much. And to Mark Thurston, what has HS2 done to ameliorate the effect of HS2 on the environment? And now, I mean, we're here as a Transport Committee, so I'm going to ask you in terms of the whole scheme of Phase 1. How successful have you been, and how are you measuring the effectiveness of your environmental mitigation schemes?
Yes, a few questions there, so I'll try and take them in turn. So, firstly, all the work we do that has a direct impact in the natural environment is all regulated by Natural England or the Environment Agency. So there's a level of oversight and scrutiny on the work we do regardless, and certainly through a lot of the detailed design we've done with the contractors in this area of the route, we've actually been able to reduce the amount, for example, of woodland or hedgerows that we've been able to take. So that's very much sort of a focus of us and the contractors doing the detailed design. I mean, just to sort of bring, so that would be my first point. Second point is we've already invested, the Mayor mentioned, so we've got 6 ecology mitigation sites around the Birmingham Solihull area already, which come to nearly 10 hectares. You've heard us talk about 700,000 trees already planted out of the 7 million. Over 300,000 of those are in the sort of northern section of the route. So, we feel we're well on the way with starting to reinvest in the natural environment, recognising there is some impact in the scheme that was approved by Parliament. So, but to the Mayor's point, I think we'll see the full benefit of that. I guess the other point I'd make in this area more broadly is, as a project, we've taken a lot of learning from High Speed 1, for example, in Kent, where, again, if you travel through Kent now, you really sort of need to sort of look out for the high-speed railway as it travels from London to the coast. And their planting schemes and the amount of land that actually used sort of was really dealt with towards the end of the project. We're very much looking to make sure that by the time this railway is open, the sort of trees, the hedgerow, the bushes, all the ecology work, the relocation of species has had a more positive effect than by the time the railway is open, to the point where it won't perhaps be the emotive issue, which it clearly is today, and that's totally justified because this is important to us. So I think it's going to be an important part of the project. The Mayor mentioned the green corridor, and again I think that's a sort of step in the right direction for big infrastructure, where we actively invest in the natural environment from the outset. And of course the other thing that's emerging through the environmental bill is this whole issue around net gain versus net zero on biodiversity, and there's every expectation that we'll look hard at how we can improve our biodiversity credentials for phase 1 and 2A, even though the legislation says we only need to have net zero. And for the 2B bill into Manchester, we're looking hard at what are the implications, cost amongst other things, on achieving net gain in biodiversity.
Thank you. Since HS2 last came to committee, and I think I've raised this before, has any more work been done around cycling and walking routes along and across the line of the route?
Yes, and unfortunately I don't have the detail, and Chair, I'm more than happy to write back actually and set this out, because there's quite a lot of work done on this, and I think to do it justice we could have consumed this committee, but we've done a lot of work with the department as well as our supply chain, and our own architectural and urban development teams have looked at a combination of things where we can provide new walking or cycling routes, particularly cycling routes, where we can create connections across the railway so we don't allow the road to sever communities or areas. And there's actually a really good story there, and for sort of very modest incremental cost, I think we hope to leave a sort of walking and cycling legacy as part of this railway, which will be again an enhancement of what's there today. And I think what I ought to do is set that out in more detail for the committee after today.
Okay, that would be well received.
Finally, one final question, bringing it back to construction and here in the West Midlands. Certainly HS2 in London and the Crossrail schemes had very strong policies around ensuring that HGVs were not a danger to pedestrians and cyclists, and a number of mitigation moves were put in place. Has the same happened here?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, if anything, we've taken the standard to a new level. I mean, Crossrail, I think, probably did set the bar there, in terms, particularly London was a challenge for them, but the regulations there, I think, for the industry more broadly, and we're very much at the sort of vanguard of that. And but nevertheless, come back to the earlier point I made, and again, if you think of the South Portal site as a case in point, we're doing all we can actually to minimise the lorry movements in the first place, because they have a noise and environmental and carbon effect. So where we can actually become more self-contained and take lorries off of local roads, because that plays to Mr. McCartney's earlier point around community disruption. So there's all part of an ecosystem that we're trying to manage here, where we do put trucks on the road, we keep it very safe, but where we can, actually we avoid sort of major haulage in the first place. And we're also, by the way, making huge, both in the London section and through the centre section, we've made huge use of rail connections, so both spoil away and materials in. So where we can, and we've put a couple of new rail connections to make sure that we can maximise the use of rail travel as well, again to try and get trucks off the road.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Ruth. Mr. Thurston, you mentioned Greg Smith, the MP for Buckingham. He can't be here because he's on maternity leave, but not even a newborn baby can silence Greg. So down the line, he has a question which I'll read out on his behalf, and it's for you, Mayor Street. He says, does the Mayor understand the impact his full-throttled support for HS2 has on people's lives along the line of route, not least when there are already 2 reliable rail routes to Birmingham? And I think he goes on to say, but I won't read it fully out, but I think he's sort of asking if you have sympathy for those further down the line that are being impacted to deliver this project here in the West Midlands.
The project isn't being delivered in the West Midlands, nor for the West Midlands. It's being delivered for the nation, is the key point. We will be the first beneficiaries and arguably the greatest, but we've had to. My simple answer to the question is, of course I understand the concerns. I've got a lot of constituents in Solihull, a very similar place, who expressed the same concerns. But I decided many years ago I was going to do the right thing, which is to get fulsomely behind this project, and that is what I have done, and I still believe it's the right thing to do for the country and definitely for this region, and that's my job.
Okay, and that's the answer for Greg. So he's not here to add a supplementary, and I'm not going to bother, despite the fact that my family all live in Buckingham. So thank you very much. Let's move on, because we want to look at the stations, and indeed we will be looking at one of the stations at Curzon Street, and we're very excited to do so. But of course, as you mentioned, you've got the Interchange Station as well. So I'm going to hand back over to Sean Bailey to take us through this section.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry,
Microphone, sorry, Sean.
oh, sorry.
That's all right. I was going to say
There
it's a
we
bit like
go.
Zoom where you're on mute.
Sorry.
We thought we'd overcome that
I'll just
over
get
that
my
part.
question
So.
up. There we go. Mr. Thurston, can I just ask you? So, in terms of the interchange station and the cost, how does the cost of construction compare with the original estimate? And could you just give us some reasons, perhaps, if there has been an increase, what the reasons for that were?
Yeah, bear with me. So we've got a budget for interchange. We have agreed some additional funding with the department in work we've done with the local planning authority to enhance the site more broadly. So we've done some work around how the car park layout will work at interchange. So we've agreed some additional funding with the government for that. But we have a budget for interchange. We've gone out to market. My expectation is that we will get competitive responses to that. And you know, and actually I also think, because it's the last of the four, that, you know, the market will sort of competitively, you know, come back to us with quotes for that station, because it's the sort of last big piece of sort of built environment assets that we're going to build. So I'd like to think that we'll you know, more than beat our budget for that.
And what's your process for monitoring that budget? I mean, do you have a sort of a stress level where perhaps you anticipate that you may go over, or, you know, what's your process for monitoring that budget? Are you and is it one that you are strictly operating within, or have you given yourself some room for manoeuvre?
Well, it's a couple of things. One is, we won't let the contract for interchange unless it is within the budget envelope we've agreed with the department. So that's a sort of test at the sort of first hurdle. Once we let the contract, it'd be like every other contract that we let. So we've, you know, over £20 billion worth of work to date, and we have a very rigorous contract management regime. All our contractors' costs are auditable. We do cost verification on their invoices. We're able to see line of sight of their costs in their supply chain, so we don't just see what we call the tier one contractor tells us. We can see much, you know, beyond that in terms of their suppliers, the tier twos and threes. So the sort of cost management and cost control regime is as good as I've seen, actually. And you know, we should take confidence that, you know, and clearly our job is to make sure we deliver this project on budget, and that's what we've set about doing.
And just to go back to the question I asked at the start, because I don't actually think I got a definitive answer, how does the cost compare with the original estimate? So the cost of the construction, what was the original estimate? And
For interchange,
for interchange?
the interchange estimate, I was just trying to get the data. So interchange is at 370 million is the number we've got in our budget for interchange.
Okay, and what was and what? So that's the estimate, or is that the final? Is that the?
That's the
original?
budget. That's the budget, and we won't know what it will cost until we've got
Okay.
prices from the supply chain.
Okay, so we're sort of waiting to see basically whether.
Exactly, and I
okay.
think to the other question, we look to let that contract in June of next year. So I think that's when we would go, you know, what would become a sort of hard money contract. And I have every confidence that we'll get a proposal from the supply chain where, you know, they have to bid against a series of criteria, which cost is clearly one. So unless it's within the budget, we wouldn't let the contract.
And is that? I mean, I'm not an expert in this. Is that standard for these type of projects? I'm just conscious, given the broader publicity we've had over HS2 and the overrunning theme of costs increasing and going over. I mean, is that quite a common way, procurement-wise, for these big construction projects, that these things would work in terms of, you know, you don't necessarily know until you've gone through supply chain and you've done that.
Well,
I mean,
we create effectively a client's estimate. So we've produced an estimate in HS2 that's been thoroughly assured and benchmarked. So that was what got signed off back at the beginning of last year by the government. That was the budget that reset the overall funding envelope for phase one of 44.6 billion. Interchange is one line item in that estimate, and that's the budget that we will now hold, and we will confirm compliance with that budget once we let the contract next year.
okay, and you're confident that you will be in compliance with that budget?
Definitely. We won't let the contract unless it meets the budget. So there's good examples on the other stations where we've been through several iterations with the sort of final preferred bidder to get to a point where we engineer the scheme to the point where it's affordable. So we won't let contracts unless we meet our affordability test.
And just out of curiosity, because obviously I'm a member of the Public Accounts Committee, our overarching theme is value for money. So on this project, and perhaps Mr. Street, you might want to come in on this as well, what to you is value for money on this project? You know, for you, what would be that overarching? It might just be one thing, but what would define value for money when it comes to this interchange? You know, the construction of interchange. How do you define value for money in this project?
I'd say two things. One is, to your earlier question, we have to absolutely make sure that we've got a scheme for the station that will meet the budget and serve the railway needs in the first instance. But I think, and the Mayor may well sort of want to build on this, I think the wider value of interchange and that whole triangle of land to the east of International is how interchange will become a gateway that, for going both north and south, as a major sort of transport connection, both for road and rail, will generate much wider value for the area. And we've done a lot of work with Solihull Borough Council and the Mayor's team in how do we maximise the land and the land capture around that site, because it's an absolute fantastic site by the M42. So I think the wider value to the region, I think the Mayor's probably best placed to comment, but the fact is we've had a sort of working group working at this now for over a year, specifically, for example, looking at the car park as a very specific case in point, as a way of maximising the land footprint, because the value to the region in that part to the southeast of Birmingham is profound. But the Mayor will...
So in terms of value, it's very difficult to answer the question about value for money for any individual piece of the project, because of course ultimately it's all got to be assessed as one, which takes us back to the earlier questions, and I'm slightly wary of pulling out one component of it. But it does lead to the wider point that Mr. Thurston has taken us to, which is that for this region, one of the absolute kernels of the whole argument is that the station at Interchange enables us to develop almost like a new sort of node of economic growth in probably the best connected place in the whole country. Now, this is what we call UK Central. The architects of that are an organisation which is an arm's length body of Solihull Council called the Urban Growth Company, and their prospectus talks about an area that will have 5,000 new homes, critical in Solihull, 650,000 square metres of new commercial space. So it is an incredible driver of economic regeneration. The station is the opener of it. It's not sufficient on its own. Its proximity to the existing West Coast Main Line, Birmingham Airport, the huge assets that is the JLR base is all part of it, and a lot more infrastructure has to be put in by a mix of regional, local and national government to unlock all of this. But that station, that 350 million, is perhaps the key to make all of this possible.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sean. Can I just go back to the Ecology review, because there seemed to be some doubt, Mr. Thurston, on whether HS2 really was the right entity to deliver the stations. Do you believe that that argument has now been settled and that you are geared to build the stations as well as the line, or are there any other ideas that you could see in the pipeline?
Just to understand the question, you mean us as HS2 Limited as the sort of delivery body for government?
Yeah, so I think the reviews concluded that HS2 Limited is not properly incentivised to maximise the value of the development of HS2 stations and may not have the capacity to properly focus on doing so.
Okay, I understand the question. So two things. One is we had to meet a pretty stringent test set by government in our contract with the DfT on capability as an organisation. And in fact, the work we did, in my experience, is as good as anything I've seen around sort of government and using organisational maturity models to demonstrate how the company was fit for purpose for the next phase of the job, recognising that at notice to proceed, that's a major commitment in investment by the government, and of course they're going to want to trust the organisation that it charges with spending all that public money. So we've done a lot of work and continue to do work to make sure the organisation stays match fit and is fit for purpose for the job in front of us. I think the second point I'm making, specific to the comments made in Doug's report, was specifically, I think, around Euston, where actually Euston is a sort of standalone project. This was actually talked about at some length at the Public Accounts Committee. Requires a different set of arrangements because the interface with Network Rail, because the interaction with the Planning Authority in London Borough of Camden, and of course Lendlease, who the government has appointed as a master development partner. The reality is we have continued to support the government in the development of Euston. We're looking at putting a joint team together with Network Rail to deliver what's required at Euston. But I think, as you heard from Mr. Maxwell, the SRO at the PAC, there are still some decisions to be made by government exactly what we do at Euston. But inevitably, the Ecology review shone a light on the capability of the company, the constitution of the board, my leadership team. I've got a new chair arriving in the second half of the year. That's all part of the inevitable need to make sure that we've got the right arrangements in place, the right people in place to take the project forward.
Okay, and yes, I mean, you touched on these things before. I think it was when I was in the Public Accounts Committee, we focused on the sheer size of the project that involves both the Network Rail angle and the HS2 angle. I mean, has there been any further movement in terms of perhaps HS2 doing all of that rather than Network Rail? Or maybe Landlease doing the whole thing and making it a private enterprise?
We've looked at a number of models with the government as the best arrangements for Euston. Our expectation is once the government decide and the department decide what is the right solution for Euston, and they're not there yet, and I think that's a decision we can expect quite soon. I think what will flow from that is what are the right organisation arrangements to deliver that. My expectation is twofold. That HS2 will absolutely take a sort of primary role to lead the delivery of the HS2 station. As you know, I think we've said we've appointed Maestro Gardos to build the station for us, and they're on site now. I think Lendlease bring some very specialist skills to the sort of Euston campus. I think we should absolutely leverage those because their experience in oversight development and making use of sort of commercial sort of development skills are going to be crucial. And I think what we need to work out is what's the relevant part of Network Rail Station that needs to be part of the integrated solution. And then I think to your question, and we've yet to work this out, what is sort of division of responsibility between HS2 Limited and Network Rail?
Okay, thank you. And Mayor Street, we were very impressed when we had our private session with the Midlands Connect and indeed all the business representatives this morning, and they were complimentary about the way they interact with you. I mean, do you not feel that you've got, seeing as you're looking at the regeneration of the wider piece, would you be interested in taking on the role of delivering the stations as opposed to HS2?
So there's a subtlety to this, isn't there? And in a sense, the conversation we've just had about interchange reveals our answer to it. They build the station, quite content with that, but that is only the beginning of the story. It then has to be the UGC that then masterminds bringing the economic activity around the station to life. So we have set up our vehicle to oversee that, and that works with the landowners, the two councils, the Solihull as a planning authority. So we've taken a step which is all about maximising the benefit of them building the station. But as I always joke with Mark, the station is the simplest bit of it, frankly. It's then everything that follows on beyond it. And our model is different to Euston, but I'm confident that we've made a decision about how we're going to do it. It's different again in the city centre because we don't have a growth company or a mayoral development corporation such as Old Oak Common. So the model in the city centre is that, again, they build the station, but then the city council here, as the planning authority, have done their master plan around it, so they know the objective, and then individual developments in what's actually more in a sense, developed property market will come forward to fill that out. And in terms of financial assistance to that in the city centre, the Greater Birmingham and Solihull LEP negotiated with, it was actually George Osborne as Chancellor, for the extension of the enterprise zone model. So there again, there is a different funding support mechanism. So I think the answer to your question, Mr. Chair, is at the different stations along the line, different answers have come to how will we ensure the economic benefits around each station.
But with regard to Curzon Street and the interchange, there's nothing going on right now that makes it harder for you to deliver the vision you've talked about for the wider piece because you're not in control of the build. So you're entirely happy with everything that's being done by HS2 in the build of those stations.
So let's be absolutely clear. At interchange, there was a very difficult issue which was left when the notice to proceed occurred, and that was this question of the land use around the flat car park. But we are working in collaboration with HS2 to solve that. From a regional point of view, it does have to be solved, otherwise it would be a crying shame and a waste of the most valuable land in the region.
Okay, thank you. And I was going to bring Sir Geoffrey in, but I think, Sean, yours is relevant to point, is that right?
Mr. Street, obviously you don't have spatial planning powers, do you?
No.
For your role. Can I just ask, if you did have spatial planning powers?
Sorry, Mike again.
Oh, sorry. If you did have spatial planning powers as Metro Mayor, what difference would that make on the delivery of this project in terms of the combined authorities role? And do you think perhaps that maybe makes a case for spatial planning powers?
I don't think it would. So again, if we take interchange as the best example of this, without the formal spatial planning power, I think everyone would agree that we've played absolutely the linchpin role between HS2 Limited, the council, the UGC. So we've been able effectively to do that without the formal power. But as I hope is apparent to you from a number of things you've said, Mr. Chair, this is actually, a lot of this is based on good relations between the different players in the region. A lot of it is not actually around a formal structure around that. So we don't, for example, have a mayoral development corporation that gives the power. We have to do it much more through the influence and the coalescing.
Okay, Mr. Jeffrey.
Mr. Street, I can see you're a very far-sighted man. Looking forward to this railway being opened, clearly it is in everybody's interest that it gets maximum use, both from an economic point of view and from the environmental considerations that Ms. Cadbury was asking about earlier. Correct. Now that is the key to that is the fare structure, the fare box. Is it premature yet? Have you been having any discussions with the department of what the fare structure should be?
There's something else before that, the timetable.
Well, I'm assuming that Mr. Thurston's right, it's going to be built on time.
No, the timetable about what services will actually be run.
Yes,
and this,
yes,
and
yes.
he think, oh God, he'll put his hand over his head now and say, here he goes. But there is a point I did want to land with the committee about this. Currently, the proposal is that, as Mr. Thurston said, the first stage will be a contained high-speed function, London, over at Common to Birmingham. Great. The second stage, when Crewe opens, there is currently no proposal that services will run from Birmingham north onto the West Coast Main Line. I think, to your point, that would A, hold up the adoption of HS2 as the favoured route, which we want everyone to get on board with early, and B, will actually be negative in terms of the payback on the project. So that is an issue where there is currently discontent in the West Midlands that is not in the plan. And I'm pleased that we've been able just to log that. The issue of the pricing, straight answer to your question, is we have made exactly that point to the DFT, but there has not yet been any discussion about the fare structure that there will be.
Because there's clearly tension, isn't it? The government's going to want the maximum fares to get the maximum return, but on the other hand, you naturally will want the maximum number of people travelling, which means you may not necessarily want the maximum fares.
Well, the government will want the maximum revenue. They won't necessarily want the maximum fares. So there'll be a lot, and I think that's it might sound pedantic, but it's a very important difference. So I think there's modelling as to how that will be achieved, but certainly we will want the public to see this as something they want to use frequently and naturally, and obviously fares will keep up that. But the straight answer to your question is no, we have not been engaged in a conversation about that as yet.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Can we just, Mr. Street, I just want to make sure that we've got you correct here, what you've just said, because it's an important point for you. I didn't completely follow it, so I'm going to ask you again in idiot's terms. You said you were concerned about the trains not going further north. So are you working on the basis that if 2A is built, then actually they don't come through the existing HS2 line?
Let me explain myself. I've clearly
do.
not done a good job at explaining it. It might seem a subtle point, but it is worth logging to the previous question about the public adopting it. So the current proposal is once the Crewe section is open, so you could run a train from Curzon Street on HS2 onto the West Coast Main Line at Crewe, so thus providing a service from Birmingham to Manchester to Glasgow, whatever. That is not in the current proposed timetable.
So it would stop at the interchange, but not Curzon Street?
Yes, you'd be able to get a train from, let's hope Euston is open by then, from Euston or Old Oak Common through Interchange to Manchester or Glasgow, but you will not be able to do one of the things that is really important to the West Midlands, is to provide the link from the centre of Birmingham through to Manchester, because the most congested trains from Birmingham at the moment are the ones that go out through the Black Country through Wolverhampton to Manchester North.
Yeah, so when I was looking at the map, I could see the triangle, which I think comes out at was Coleshill and then Lichfield. So ideally you would want the trains to run all the way up at Birmingham Interchange and Curzon Street and then come back out and go up towards...
No, that's not in the plan.
Right.
I'm absolutely with Mr. Thurston about this. The trains that will go to Manchester from Euston over time will go Interchange straight up to the north. Different trains will come in to the centre of the city. That's absolutely sensible. But the long-term proposal is trains will start in Curzon Street to go to destinations in the north, replacing the current services that do that, which are very congested, very slow, doesn't give us, right to the very first question, the connectivity north of Birmingham. And the current proposal is that those services do not start until the line is open all the way to Manchester. I think that is a huge missed opportunity and prevents the adoption of the service by the public.
Excellent, that's clear to me. But you want to come back, Jeff, and then I want to bring in Reed.
I slightly got the impression...
Microphone again, sorry.
I slightly got the impression that Mr Thurston had a different view on this. Are you ad idem with the Mayor on this issue?
Yeah, I make 2 points. One is there's an agreed service pattern that sits behind the business case, which is what the Mayor's referring to. But the reality is, in time, exactly what service pattern gets used when the railway and the infrastructure is available is to be determined. And that's going to be a combination of a discussion between the department, Network Rail in its new form, and the train operator. So, notwithstanding, the Mayor's right, the current base case doesn't have, when we open phase 1, trains starting in Birmingham going to Manchester. I think there are some stopping services from memory. I'm not an expert on the timetable, but I think the reality is the actual service pattern. We've got to remember the West Coast partner, the reason we're working with a partner today is because the expectation is, and they are running the existing West Coast mainline services, and of course when the new railway is open, they will run both. And I think they've got a really important role to play in working with local stakeholders, ourselves and others, around what is the most optimum service pattern that serves the important cities of the Midlands and the North, combining both the existing railway and the new railway.
I'll just say one other thing about it, because I think it illustrates another underlying point that we haven't got to yet. One of the real drivers for us in doing this is to free our existing network of the high-speed trains. Everybody knows that. So it will seem rather odd to citizens that we've built this new capacity, but we're still running the London-Manchester trains on our existing railway, the Birmingham-Manchester trains on our existing railway, and therefore not able to invest in local connectivity as soon as we would wish.
Ruth.
Well, Mayor Street's just answered the question I wanted to ask, because I hadn't quite grasped that, because to me and to a lot of people, HS2 isn't just about reducing journey times, it's about increasing capacity on our rail network, and thank you for clarifying that. I want to go back to stations. I have one quick question to Mayor Street. The design of the Curzon Street station building has been described as something like a modern airport terminal. Do you think it could be better than that?
That was one view. It's by an erudite person, but one view. It's gone through planning now. We are agreed. It's gone to tender. I'm afraid we have to say that's it.
Sounds like you might agree that it could be better, but thank you for your honest answer.
And I should apologise, because I was the one that mixed up some of the order, which is why I threw one at Sean when he wasn't expecting it. I should have actually gone to Simon, but I think the skills part we still haven't quite covered on stations.
There's a couple of matters actually I wouldn't mind raising, but based on the conversation we've just been having, actually, firstly, to Mr. Thurston, you've got one heck of a job on your hands in delivering this, but also in forming relationships on both sides and ends of this line. You've got devolved mayors, both of which have very different sets of powers. One would like more, and one already has the lion's share. What's it been like working with devolved mayors on both sides and both ends of the line?
I mean, that's a fair question. I don't get to choose whether these questions are fair, do I? But no, and I'm probably more of a question probably for my chairman, actually, because Alan's done some great work working with politicians on the route, and that very much is more the chair's role than mine. I mean, without being glib, we've got good relationships with stakeholders all along the line. To the earlier point, of course, people are concerned around the disruption in the near term, but in terms of sort of shaping the future of what this railway could do for Birmingham, for Manchester, and in fact, the relationships we have with leaders, the leader of Camden, for example, in Euston, there's a sense of ambition and a sense of collaboration, I mean, the Mayor made a point that a lot of the structures and arrangements we have, Interchange being a case of point, are not formal, they are informal, and a lot of collaboration goes on between the company, the department and local authorities. And of course, you've got different sort of shades of grey on all these things, but generally it's very positive because there's an overwhelming sort of political support to the project, which we get the benefit from.
Is there a concern, though, without having a formal structure, that informal relationships can and do break down, and that could affect the delivery of a project and the overall vision? For example, if funding for future parts of the HS2 line are adapted, changed or cut?
I guess to some extent that question is probably for the politicians, but what I would say is one of the really positive things that the government did, in my view, on the back of notice to proceed, was appoint a dedicated minister. And Andrew Stevenson has been a force for good, sort of being an ambassador for the project, but also using his role to build relationships with regional political leaders right along the route, and continues to play a really active role in being not just in holding me to account, which is totally legitimate, but at the same time is out promoting the projects and helping build those bridges with politicians along the route. Clearly, if the world changes, to your point around funding other things, then we'd need to deal with that in the fullness of time. But it's not for me to sort of try and predict the future. But having Andrew and a minister dedicated to the project, I think has been a great thing, a great decision.
I'm glad you're both still treasured colleagues sat on that table after my initial question about relationships. I'll go to the Mayor if I may. Clearly, as I alluded to in my first question, the powers you have are distinctly different to that of the Mayor of London. You've consistently, since your election a couple of years ago, called for more powers as the Metro Mayor, sensibly so in my view. Do you feel that, as the Mayor, you could have had a stronger decision-making role in the rollout of HS2?
No, I don't actually. The areas where we're asking for further powers have not been directly relevant to this, actually. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It goes beyond the powers of mayors piece, but I will never know why the government decided they would impose a mayoral development corporation in Old Oak Common, for better or worse, and took a different model here. But that's not really what we're arguing about in the general powers piece. So no, probably my answer. I am comfortable that I can influence it through. It's doing this job. You learn that everyone is obsessed with the formal powers, but actually they're not the things that ultimately determine what you get done. Ultimately, what determines what you get done is the influence that you can bring, the power to convene, the power to persuade ultimate decision makers. And I actually think that's what we've used in this case, not a formal power piece.
Much appreciated. Now, changing tack slightly, I just wanted to focus on a key question I think that a lot of people will have about the project, and in particular in one station. So we have seen a lot more people work from home if they have the broadband capacity to do so and their job can afford that. For example, when we're looking at Curzon Street, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic, that change, that focus, and clearly the government changing their tactics slightly on next week's relaxation of restrictions, will affect the projected passenger numbers for a station like Curzon Street? I'll ask you, Mr. Mayor, first, if I may.
No. I mean, what's going to happen next week is irrelevant to the numbers obviously in the short term. But what the question really is: do I think that what we've all been through is fundamentally going to change working patterns in 10 years' time? And I'm in the camp, and I may be in a minority here, I'm in the camp which says no. I actually think that people will return. It'll take time to build confidence. We know there's real fear, but actually the notion of a physical place where people exchange what we've come to talk of work, I still think that's going to be the model, actually. And I see there's nothing in 250 years of human history since the Industrial Revolution that says people will travel less, and I still don't believe there will be.
Forgive my indulgence on this question, but do you think that's the same for both ends of the line? We have a very different economic picture up here. The cost of living here in Birmingham is considerably cheaper than that of central London, for example. And what we've seen is that people have decided to move even to the southwest, even to my part of the country,
Yes.
when they used to work and live in Canary Wharf, for
Yes.
example. Do you think that's the same result, both ends of the line?
We think that this whole north shoring, as we call it, I don't know whether southwest goes into the north shoring, we think that's one of the trends that is actually going to help us in make sure that the economic numbers on which the case is partly predicated will be valid.
Fascinating. Thank you.
And just quick couple of questions from me, and probably to you, Mr. Thurston. Are you worried about the cost of supplies, and also indeed the getting hold of the supplies, your raw materials, etc.?
Well, we've certainly got work going on with the contractors to make sure that what feels like and hopefully is a sort of short-term pressure in the system. We're seeing some inflationary pressures on cost for materials, mostly rather than labour. And I think that's a symptom of a number of things from last year, some other pressures in the market. We've seen this sort of huge, almost sort of bow wave of construction activity in the last few months, actually. And that inevitably is creating some sort of heating. But my sense is it will pass. I mean, there's various predictions about whether it will be sort of level out by the end of this year or through the spring of next. So, yes, we're exercised about it. We're looking at, I mean, I think we're slightly privileged in HS2 in that the quantities of sort of what we need is so vast that we've had to sort of self-contain our own supply. And of course, in many articles in the media, we get quoted as being the reason for it. Of course, actually, the reality is our percentage demand to the overall supply in the market is quite low. But nevertheless, I think the sector as a whole, construction more broadly, is seeing that short-term pressure. And we're vigilant and making sure that we're keeping on top of that where we need to.
I mean, I've heard that as well. I mean, I went to a garden supplies place and they said you can't get any timber because HS2's bought it all. So actually, and indeed a bag of cement was also quoted.
Yeah, we don't buy cement by the
I
bags
did
at
wonder why
HS2,
we don't
so-
know, but I suppose the bag comes from a bigger pile. So I mean, it's not the case that HS2 is having any impact on the ability of customers to get supplies or the price of their.
It doesn't appear to be the case. Yeah, I think there's a number of factors here. There is a shortage in the country of HGV drivers, so deliveries are actually part of the root of the problem. There's a legacy, I think, of a lot of stockpiling at the back end of last year when the market was deflated and a lot of staff were furloughed. And I think we're seeing then the pickup. And actually, as the sort of economy has started to get back on the front foot, I think through the first half of this year, we've seen this sort of almost explosion in growth in construction more broadly. You've only got to look around major city centres and see the numbers of cranes. So I think big push on house building. So I think it's a multiple factors. We're in the mix on that, of course, as a big project. And we're working with other players just to make sure that we've got what we need.
And are you both working on the academy? Because we've heard that's had a bit of a bumpy ride from previous sessions.
What was the High-Speed Rail College?
Yes.
Yeah, well,
sorry, I call it the academy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's been work by the company and the combined authority as working with Birmingham University, who've now taken on effectively the ownership of what's now become the College of Transport and Infrastructure. So it's got a broader remit and it's now sort of back on a much more sound financial footing thanks to the intervention of the university. I know the Mayor, amongst others, has played the part in ensuring that that continues to thrive, because clearly in the long term having the Skills Academy for what we do is crucial.
Okay. Well, look, we'll leave it there. We've gone over time. Thank you both very much indeed for all of your evidence. Thank you, Mayor Street, for having us up here in Birmingham. We're so pleased to be out on the road, on the road again.
Yeah.
Mr. Thurston, if we were to go somewhere else on the line of route, where would you recommend we go and visit next?
Buckingham.
Well, I do that whenever I see my mum, Mayor Street, but we've actually covered that aspect, and we've been to Euston as well, so we're looking further north, perhaps, actually.
Yeah, rather than do that on my feet, let me give that some thought, because I think there is other sort of locations that I think the committee would get value from, so I'll come back to you with some choices there.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much. Wish you a good rest of your day. Order. Thanks a lot. Sorry to go over time there. No, I could see that we needed to wrap up. So thank you very much indeed.